following talk is offered freely to ensure that no one is ever denied access to these practices and to these teachings. If you feel inspired to make a donation to support this offering, you can go to my website at jonathanfoust.com. While you're there, you can also sign up for a monthly newsletter designed to support you in your practice. Thank you, and enjoy.
So last night, of course, was the Super Bowl. Most people follow, I don't know about most, but a lot of people just follow the sports like they watched as a kid, maybe with a parent. And my dad was mostly into football. So he would grade papers with a football game in the background. So my allegiance would shift wherever I lived. I grew up in Pennsylvania, so it was the Eagles and the Steelers, and then went to college in Wisconsin. And in order to fit in with my teaching internship, I started watching, the Packers. Then I lived in Massachusetts for 20 years. So, of course, I think it's illegal to not follow the Patriots if you live in New England. And it was actually therapeutic. I worked a lot, so Sunday afternoons in a little village I lived, I'd watch football with the local alcoholics down at the bar. Some people are really, really fanatic, and I ran across this post. This is someone posted this online. A friend of mine has 2 tickets for the 2019 Super Bowl, 50-yard line box seats. She paid $2,500 each, but she didn't realize last year when she bought them, it was going to be on the same day as her wedding. If you are interested, she's looking for someone to take her place. It's in St. Michael's Church at 3 p.m. The groom's name is George. He's 5'7", about 155 pounds, and he'll be wearing a tux. So as usual, or quite often, the opening joke has nothing to do with the topic for tonight, but I just had to share that. What I do want to talk about tonight is a little bit on what are called the refuges. We're all seeking some kind of safety, and we're all looking for happiness, and we're doing it in different ways. When I was about 6 or 7 years old, I unconsciously developed a strategy, and this was my strategy. I would imagine the worst thing that could possibly happen in full detail, so I wouldn't be surprised if it happened. And in some way, I was making myself feel safe. So when my parents would drive away, it'd be like they could die in a car crash. I was a morbid little kid, but I wasn't surprised by anything. But what I was doing was I was trying to soothe myself. It wasn't exactly satisfying, but it was a habitual way I was unconsciously trying to make it okay. That habitual way of thinking really set me up for kind of a lifelong struggle with anxiety, because I was habituated to anticipating the worst. And as Mark Twain famously said, the worst things in my life actually never happened. We kind of live in this fantasy of what could go wrong. But really what we're doing is we're trying to make it okay. We're trying to self-soothe. And that's what worry and anxiety is. It's an effort to try to gain control of our lives. So if I could imagine the worst, I had some control over the randomness of my life. When I realized that, it was quite a revelation. So if you were lucky as a little kid, you took refuge in your mother or your father or your primary caretaker. If you got hurt, you'd run to them, and they would hold you, let you know that it's okay. Your refuge may have been your parents or your family or a dog. And some of us didn't get that refuge. We didn't have that sense of really feeling safe and held. Many of us have not. So we look for refuge. We look for safety. A very popular one is money. If I have enough money, then I'll be okay. That sense of money is like, I'll be safe. Of course, there are plenty of other refuges we go to. Drugs, legal or illegal, are a way we go for self-soothing. Sex and work and entertainment, reading, video, movies, all of that are places we go to feel safe and nurtured. And you could say that everything you do is taking refuge. Everything you do is to soothe your anxiety. And any refuge is really designed to do two things. First is designed to free you up from suffering and stress and dissatisfaction. And the second is possibly there to make you happy. So we all take refuge. And we know that belief in some higher power or some higher intelligence has a way of holding you in a protective way. If you're in AA or any of those, you take refuge in a higher power, however you create that, however you perceive that higher power. It's a conscious part of the process. You're in relation to something bigger than you, and it satisfies something very primal. If you're a doctor, you take the Hippocratic Oath. You're really taking refuge in this code of ethics that holds you. If you're a scientist, you're really tuning into a long lineage of scientists who've gone before you, building up this way of looking at reality. If you're in politics, you have some orientation with a philosophy that's forged by those that come before you. So we all have this desire to connect with a refuge, with something bigger than us. One of the Buddha's insights in his awakening was this realization that everyone was looking for happiness in exactly the wrong way. That we're looking for happiness in things that were destined to change. So looking for happiness in sense pleasure, looking for happiness in relationships that are all going to disappear one day. So we're looking for things to make us happy that ultimately will not be satisfying. All these temporal things that are ultimately changing and not dependable at all. So what I'd like to talk about tonight are what it means to take refuge in something that's beyond the temporal and the causal. And these refuges are considered timeless and limitless. So I'm going to explore each one, because each one of these three refuges has sort of an outer refuge, and then an inner refuge, and what you can think of as the innermost refuge. And depending on how you sort of view things and your character structure, one of these may resonate more than others. So these refer to taking refuge in the Buddha, which is taking refuge in awareness itself, taking refuge in the Dharma, And the Dharma is translated as truth or a path, and taking refuge in Sangha, which is community or love. And then we're going to do a little refuge ceremony with hopefully you've got your little cord, and I'll talk a little bit about the history of the refuge ceremony, and then we'll all be suited up. If you don't have one, don't worry, we'll get one to you. So taking refuge in the Buddha. So it's an interesting question. So who actually was the Buddha? Well, we have the historical Buddha, and then we have the Buddha as sort of an allegory for the hero's journey. And then we have the Buddha as this representation of your innermost self. From the outer perspective, some find the historical Buddha to be a profound source of inspiration. The belief that someone walked the earth and became fully awake to the nature of reality. So the historical Buddha was born in 624 BC in a place called Lumbini, which is now in Nepal. His mother's name was Maya Devi. His father's name was Shuddhodana, and his name was Siddhartha. Many of us, we know the story of the Buddha's life, but his father was a Brahmin and a wealthy king of his region. And he was told by Brahmins that his son would either be a great teacher or a great leader. And he preferred leader. So he protected his son as carefully as he could. So he lived a very indulged life, kind of protected from the travails of human life. But despite this protection, the young Siddhartha was exposed to what are called the 4 heavenly messengers. He saw someone who was sick. He saw someone who was old. He saw a dead body. And he saw a renunciate. He saw a monk. And he asked, with sickness, old age, and death, in his shock, does this happen to everyone? And he was assured it does. And then he met this monk who seemed to have a certain quality of freedom about him, and that set him off on his journey. And of course, after many struggles and trials, he achieves this goal of wakefulness. And then the rest of his life is traveling and teaching and creating a legacy that 2,500 years later is still very alive on this planet. And this historical Buddha dies at age 83. So this idea of this historical Buddha for many people is very soothing. Someone has walked this path before me. And here are these historical details that make it alive and make it real. On the other hand, what do we really know about the Buddha? Nothing he actually said was put on paper until many, 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 many generations later. Some say 454 years after his death. So at that time, the teachings were held in the oral tradition. So people would recite certain chants that would kind of codify his teachings. And the Pali Canon is considered kind of the standard when they all the practitioners came together and they tried to codify, okay, what did he actually say? Let's write this down. And so there's this real question of, well, what did the Buddha actually say? And how much of it is just interpreted after hundreds of years of people saying what he said? Of course, this reminds me of a joke. And this is an old one, you probably know this one, but a young monk in a Christian monastery is transcribing ancient texts. And he asked to meet with the abbot. And he says, I'm copying these words over, but I'm just wondering if a mistake was made, 100 years ago, and we're just copying it over and over again, wouldn't it be good from time to time to check the original texts? And the abbot said, that's a really good idea. No one's done this for hundreds of years. And so this old abbot, he goes down into the belly of the archives, and he's there for a really long time. And this young monk starts to get concerned, and he goes down in the catacombs and finds his way back, and he hears this abbot crying. And he follows the sounds of the cries, and there's this abbot, he's crying, and he's rending his garment and banging his head against the wall. And the young monk says, what's wrong? And the abbot looks up from this original text and he says, it says celebrate. So you never know. And it is very interesting when you look at in the Buddha's time, women were not allowed to ordain. And he was besieged by a number of people asking him to ordain women, and he did agree, but they were separate, and the oldest, wisest female was subservient to the youngest male monk initiate. So it's very interesting to see how in his day he did something quite radical, but we look now and it seems quite archaic. And even now, in sort of modern Buddhism, there's a tremendous amount of upheaval around sort of the patriarchy, and particularly in the Theravada tradition, where you've got all these monks, who are making up the rules for how to live completely through this perspective of renunciate, celibate males coming up with the rules for practice. So just a very interesting thing, and why I really celebrate the kind of the evolution of our practice here. So many people find studying the Buddha's life to be very powerful because the Buddha's life is the perfect example of the hero's journey, kind of the archetype of the hero's journey. And the Buddha's life is our life. And if you're not familiar, there are 12 steps to the hero's journey. First, there's the step of living in the ordinary world. And then there's the call. Something calls you. And then you refuse the call, and you try to stay ordinary. And then something wakes you up, and quite often it's a mentor or a teacher, just as it was for the Buddha. Like, here was this monk, like, what is he doing? So something wakes you up, and then you cross the first threshold. And then there are all kinds of tests and trials. There are allies and enemies, all kinds of ordeals. And then at some point, a realization begins, where you see clearly, and then you begin the road back, and you return back to your life, wiser and from a place of service. We all walk that path. So knowing this, having this sense of the steps that the Buddha went through in his journey. When he first began to practice, he worked with the practitioners of that day, which were different forms of yoga, which were austerities. So he engaged into these extreme austerities of creating transcendent experiences by pushing the body to extremes, extreme fasting, holding the body in extreme positions, etc., etc. it built certain qualities, certainly concentration, resilience, and moments of transcendence. But then he realized these are not liberating experiences. They're transcendent experiences, but they're liberating. They're not liberating. And so his practice shifted, and he tried different techniques, studied with different people, and began to find his own way. So when you look at the life of the Buddha, it's a beautiful reflection of this, of your inner world as well. So then here we have the outer refuge of the Buddha, the historical Buddha. We have the inner, this allegorical quality of the Buddha. But then there's the innermost quality of refuge. So Siddhartha was the Buddha's childhood name through his young adulthood. After his awakening, he was called the Buddha. So what does the Buddha mean? There's a beautiful story where the Buddha was allegedly, again, who knows, was stopped by someone in the street. And he had quite a reputation. And someone said, "What are you? Are you a mystic? Are you a magician? Are you a sorcerer? Are you a teacher?" And the Buddha said, "I'm awake." And the word Buddha means awake. And this is the innermost refuge. In any moment, you can be awake. Remembering that you are the one who is aware. Yes, you're the body. Yes, you're the composite of all the conditions that have formed your character structure. But ultimately, you're the one who is awake right now. And that can be a profound inner refuge. Simply taking refuge in, I'm awake right now. So remembering that there's this quality of wakefulness, that there's a quality of wisdom that is accessible to you, can be quite profound. We tend to think it's out there in some magical place. But it's actually something you can tap into at any given time. In the Christian tradition, there's a phrase, WWJCD, what would Jesus Christ do? Like just pausing and asking. It helps you to kind of access a higher quality of mind. In that same way, if you like, you can try WWBD. What would the Buddha do right now? And just asking that question is a shift in consciousness. So the second refuge refers to taking refuge in the Dharma. And here, the outermost element of the Dharma are specific sets of teachings. So if you want to be a good tennis player, it's really good to be on a team. And it's really good to play with people better than you. And that's going to kind of hone your skills. In that same way, if you're stuck in your life and you're confused and you're hijacked by aversion and greed, it's really helpful to be around people who can see a little more clearly than you at that time. So the Buddha created a specific set of instructions to help people wake up. And what they include is the rigor required in training the mind to see clearly. The foundation of right concentration. To develop your capacity to pay attention on purpose will help you to calm your mind so it is less hijacked by all the modifications of mood and feeling and thought. And then from this place of concentration, you can develop your capacity for mindfulness. That sense of taking the seat of the witness, to be the observer of what is changing. You find you're less reactive. You're more responsive to life. You're more awake. And you can begin to see more clearly into the nature of reality, to see into the nature of change, into the nature of suffering, into the nature of the self, of what you really are. These teachings are riverbanks. So in all traditions, we have ethical teachings as the very foundation. The 10 Commandments and yoga, the yamas and niyamas, the observances and restraints. And in the Buddhist tradition, there's what's referred to as sila. The things that you do to refrain from doing yourself and others harm. To take only what is given freely. To be aware of not doing harm through speech. To not cloud the mind through intoxicants, etc. In AA, your commitment is to refrain from the substance or the practice that you know is not good for you. You design your life not to go there. So anything you want in your life requires some will and dedication and sacrifice. So in my years of living in a spiritual community, I had a celibacy vow and a poverty vow in my 20s and 30s. It took a lot of effort to stay on that path. I got so much out of it, like immeasurable results out of those practices. But I really needed strict riverbanks to help me walk that path. So I adhered to a very strict set of teachings so my mind wouldn't get distracted as much. So whenever you want something, you're going to have to narrow your attention. You're going to have to decide what you're not going to do in order to get it. And that's this outermost interpretation of the Dharma. It's the path, it's the teachings. So for some people, they find, I need a set of rules to live by. I need a code of ethics to live by. And if I live by this code of ethics, I'm going to not only minimize the harm I do to myself and others, but I'm going to take those wide riverbanks and narrow them down so I can move toward what I most want in my life. So that's the outermost interpretation. Then this points toward the innermost, or the inner, not the innermost, but the inner path is about getting clear on what is your path. The word Dharma also refers to your work in the world. What is your path? So for many years, I was intensely passionate about developing hands-on healing skills. It was actually while I had my celibacy vow, I thought, well, if I can touch legally, let me do this. So I had this way of studying, and I was really excited about it, where I'd be learning some new modality, and I'd find the best person in the room, and I would just become that person. You know, it's kind of it's a neuro-linguistic programming, kind of like super learning technique. I'd breathe like them and practice with them, and it really speeded up how I would learn. And I remember, I'd find out who was best. I would really study very, very intensely, and I really wanted to learn everything I could about this particular hands-on discipline. And I learned it pretty quickly. I got a certain degree of mastery over time. But then I noticed that while I had that technique, I found out that I wanted to do it a little bit differently. Because doing it a little bit differently actually felt more organic for me. And then I found, as I explored very rigorously, a number of these healing modalities, I discovered I had my own expression. There was just a blend of these practices that kind of organically came through me. And I think this is what happens in our lives. You narrow your attention and learn certain disciplines, and then you find out what your expression is. And this can be quite powerful. And as part of the training and meditation is to when you learn different techniques, whether it be the shamatha concentration techniques, or whether it's the witnessing techniques, or the body scan techniques, or the loving kindness techniques, or the surrender techniques, all the different techniques that are out there, what's really helpful is to really give yourself fully to them. Really learn everything you can, and then determine, does this resonate for you? Is this really an expression of your path? There's a great phrase from Mahatma Gandhi. It really speaks to kind of the failure to identify your path. Because kind of the sort of the lazy way out is to just choose a path that someone chooses for you. That's kind of what happens in life. You know, okay, I'm going to do this. And at some point you realize, whose life am I living? What do I want? What's my expression? And then the 40 days and nights in the desert to figure out what your path is, and then to live from that place. But Mahatma Gandhi said, and this refers to Dharma, like your path. He said, better to try and fail at your own Dharma than to succeed at someone else's. So that points to a very, very deep question. Are you living a life that is true for you? Now, what this next points to is the innermost refuge of Dharma, which is taking refuge in what is true. And that is a deeply internal experience. What is true? We have relative truth, and then there's absolute truth. There's a time that we believed in our culture that bloodletting was the most effective way to reduce a fever. Then we didn't believe it anymore. Taking refuge in what is true speaks toward perennial truth. Are there things now that are true today that were true 5,000 years ago? And are there things that are true today that will be true 5,000 years from now? It's that truth we're talking about. And it becomes a very interesting inquiry. What do you know to be true? It's a very powerful distinction between it can feel real, but is it true? And here this points toward something the Buddha spoke about, which is how as you become more present in the moment-to-moment reality of your life, and as you free up your consciousness to really explore the nature of reality, that you begin to see into the three characteristics of reality. You begin to see that everything changes. Anything born of causes and conditions is going to change. And that's the nature of anicca, impermanence. The second thing you begin to see is that anything that you are resisting is going to result in suffering or stress or dissatisfaction. So your relationship to change equals your relationship to suffering. If something is changing, you don't want it to, or something isn't changing and you do want it to the degree you're upset, you're going to experience rope burn. And then the third characteristic of reality, that's dukkha, or dissatisfaction or suffering. The third nature of reality is into what's called anatta, the nature of self. And it's the recognition that if you think this body is permanent, you may be in for a disappointment. So it's the recognition that the self, who you are, is made up of the conditioned, subject to change, and also the unconditioned. There's something about who you are that is unconditioned and beyond change. And you know that intuitively. If you ever had a transcendent moment, a mystical moment, a sense of the mystery, you have a sense of what that is. That is there as well as the relative. So taking refuge in the Dharma, for some can be a set of teachings that for you is it's the code. You live in these set of this code, and you feel safe. For some, it's more a question of, does this resonate with me? Is this my path? That deep desire to know, what is my path in the world? And then the innermost, what is true? What do I know to be true right now? Can I take refuge in this recognition that all conditioned things change? Anything I can let be is going to open up a sense of possibility. And can I open up my awareness beyond this sense of that this body is permanent and really embrace the unconditioned? Wow, I had no idea the time was going so fast. We're going to take a quick rip through Sangha. So, in the Buddha's day, there was a community of practitioners. He set up communities everywhere he went because he knew, and he said this 2,500 years ago, if you engage into the practice of mindfulness, you are swimming upstream. You're swimming against your own conditioning, but more than that, and again, 2,500 years ago, you're swimming against the conditioning of the culture. The culture is not designed to slow down. It's not conditioned to look toward transcendent truth. It's all about getting more of what you want and avoiding what you don't want. And so, community is a very, very important element as a refuge. A sense of belonging. And again, just referring to my own period of austerity, with celibacy and a poverty vow, there's no way I could have done it without a community. When I was really down, other people who were inspired, who lift me up, and sometimes the other way around. You may find when you go off on a retreat, an intensive retreat, there's something about being held by that group intention that is extraordinary. Have you noticed how when you meditate in a group, it's a little bit easier? Again, there's something about kind of being held in a group of shared intention that is an intangible. When two or more are gathered, there's something about that that's quite profound. There's an element as well when we move from the outermost to more toward the inner is the recognition of our common humanity. Of just recognizing that everyone you know is doing their best. Everyone you know is at times afflicted with greed and hatred and confusion. Everyone you know is trying to be happy, is trying to figure it out. And we know this because when we can really pause and do a role reversal with someone, we can really begin to sense what their life is like. We have that capacity to see ourselves in others and to see others in ourselves. That's a profound refuge. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about our interbeing, our interconnectedness. And part of waking up in your life is realizing how much we share in common. The innermost refuge in Sangha points toward love. In any given moment, there is the capacity to hold your experience, to call on empathy, compassion, and kindness. That's right now, and that's right here. And it's a very powerful training. For many of us, we don't have easy access to self-compassion or kindness. It got trained out of us really, really early. And there are practices, there are disciplines to help you develop that muscle, to really explore what it's like to increase your capacity for kindness and compassion and joy and that steadiness of heart. So we're going to close with a little refuge ceremony. This will be like our little final meditation. And just fair warning, we're going to go over a few minutes, if that's okay. And a little bit about this practice. In the Buddha's day, when there was the monsoon season, all the monks would gather together for that period of time. So they had a very strong sense of sangha, a very strong sense of connection. And then they were instructed, when the rains ended, to go out into the world and practice, to find a place in the forest where they could practice. But also, because part of the code of ethics was to not take anything that is not freely given, that the monks were in a relationship with the communities, where they would serve the community, and the community, through their generosity, would offer them alms so that they could eat. So imagine being in this cozy community with all of your friends and inspiring each other and going through transformative experiences through intensive practice, and then you're told you have to leave. And there's no pension, there's no insurance plan. It's go and practice. Imagine how terrified you might be. I can imagine how terrified I would be, anticipating the worst. And before, does anyone need a red string? If you can raise your hand, we're going to kind of bring them around. Yeah, just raise your hand up high, and we'll get this to you. So the idea here is with this string. The string is symbolic of the string from a monk's robe, and you reflect on these 3 refuges. And we'll do a little meditation. I'll invite you to tie 1 knot in the string for each of the refuges. And then you'll tie the string around your wrist, or you can tie it around your neck, around your ankle if you like. And it's considered a protection cord. As just a reminder for you to kind of tune into the refuges, however they resonate for you, whether it be the outermost, the inner, or the innermost. So if you like, you can take your string, and if you can take the 2 ends, take 1 end in either hand, and when you're ready, you can close your eyes. Take this time just to slow down your breath, reflecting on what it means to take refuge in the Buddha. This can be the historical Buddha, honoring the allegory of your own life, your own hero's journey, your own calling to be fully awake and fully alive in your life, to remember that you are on a path. Reflecting on the innermost refuge of what it means to be awake. To remember that who you are is the one who is aware. And as you're ready now, you can, reflecting on this refuge, you'll tie 1 knot in your string. And then again, closing your eyes and taking a moment to reflect on the Dharma. What are the teachings? What are the codes of conduct that most resonate for you? You're just sensing your your desire to be awake to your own path, to live your path rather than the path of another. To remember that at any given moment you can take refuge in what is true. And as you're ready, you can tie a second knot. Then closing your eyes again and taking a moment to reflect on Sangha, opening to a sense of community. Whether you have community, whether you'd like to cultivate this more, just sensing how this can be a refuge. Reflecting on our interconnectedness and the knowing that in any moment you can call on compassion and kindness and empathy. And as you're ready, you can tie the third knot. And now what you can do with your cord is, if you like, you can wrap it around your wrist 3 times, or you can tie it around you can have it around your neck. And what you're going to find is this is where you're immediately going to have to call on Sangha, because you're not going to be able to tie the knot yourself. So if you can find someone nearby, again, you can tie it around your wrist or your neck. You can even do your ankle. And then find a Sangha member to tie you up. And from here, just like the monks with the monsoon rains clearing, we will move out into our lives. If you need help getting tied up, be sure to ask someone nearby. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Enjoy. I'll see you next week.